I guess we will start with mandatory question on how are you doing during the lockdown times in terms of personal life, but also in terms of work? How it's going on Google, on remote, probably?
Yeah, I mean, we're all working from home since I believe March or something here in Switzerland. But we have had opportunities to meet, and we did instigate this new tradition of having like an optional coffee break. This is basically a video call where we just like talk about all sorts of stuff. With two of my coworkers, I this week scheduled to join a Stardew Valley farm, so that's going to be interesting. I've not played the game before, so that's going to be fun. In terms of person, so on one hand, it's not really that different from normal work life because we are usually at any given time, someone from our team is traveling to some conference somewhere. So we are always kind of remote, but normally it's remote from a hotel room or from a conference venue. Now it's more like remote from home, which is actually nice. That's an upgrade over having to travel and catch planes and all that kind of stuff. As far as I'm concerned, I got actually like a proper sleep schedule now. I live in the current time zone, which is amazing. That's a big change. For years, my time zone has been whenever it's dark outside, I sleep. That was the time zone I was in. And how is it at GitLab? I mean, you are a remotely distributed team anyways, right?
Yeah, so not that many things changed to us. We had coffee breaks before. Actually, when you are hired by GitLab, it's mandatory to have 5 coffee calls with your colleagues. And for me, it was, I think, the hardest part of the onboarding. It's like, oh my God, I need to call all these people I don't know, and this is so creepy. But of course, you know, there are very interesting people at GitLab. Probably you remember an incident of dropped database. So first person I called to was actually the guy who dropped the database. And he's still working at GitLab, which says a lot about our company and culture. Not that many things changed. I think we have more things in terms of GitLab enforce you to work less because we think during the lockdown, it's really hard to have the full capacity and performance. So they enforce us to have family and friends day, which again is really
very
funny.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's more or less the same. So far so good. Having remote team is.
That's my summary.
Do you think the performance of your team, I mean, your team was remote as well, but in general, do you feel any difference in terms of performance when you're on remote?
Not really.
Nope.
No. So what I notice is that because I am at home, I don't necessarily. So I wouldn't say I waste time in the office, but you know how it is. And then you like hang out at the fridge in the kitchen a little moment. It's like, should I? Nah, I shouldn't. I shouldn't get an ice cream now. But then you line up for a coffee, which takes a little time. You're having conversations with your coworkers, which is important and usually is very productive as well. But now you're more focused because you have to manage your time a little better when it comes to like having calls with your coworkers to have these chats and having specific designated time slots for these conversations. So that I have more time outside work, I would say. And I have more regular time outside work, which is nice. Because, for instance, when I'm in the office and I have a meeting in the morning and then I have a meeting late in the evening, then I might spend some time in the office after the first meeting, then maybe have lunch and then drive home. And then I'm basically home and getting back to work before the meeting that I take from home. Whereas now, where I take the morning meeting from home, then I go outside and cycle, or I meet a friend, or I go diving. I don't know, do stuff basically, and then come back in the afternoon and then take the other meeting. So I make more out of the time that I have now, which is great. And I really enjoy that. And I notice that performance-wise, that doesn't change anything, which is mind-blowing to me.
I know. I mean, not mind-blowing for me because I've been working remotely for years, but still. So I wonder, like, do Google in general have any plans to leave a few teams on remote, or maybe the whole team on remote? I remember Twitter announced something like this, right?
So I think what we announced is that this year there will not be a regular office work kind of schedule. And I think, I'm not sure what Sundar said publicly, but I think it was like until June next year or something, working from home until 2021. I think that's what I know, but there might be, yeah. Summer 2021 is until summer 2021, we should probably mostly be working from home. Which is fine. And to be honest, it doesn't, for my team at least, it doesn't make a difference because we have been on and off the office anyway. As I said, we're a distributed team. We have some people sitting in Mountain View, some others sitting in Singapore. To us, it doesn't make a difference.
Well, Google sounded like a dream job even previously. Right now, with all the remote possibilities, it's sounds even more fantastic. So next question is kind of like continuation of the previous one. Do you even hire right now? Did lockdown and COVID situation affected hiring plans?
It does. As right now, we need to figure out how to work with existing employees and how the different teams work together and where there's areas of improvement and what we need to do to protect our culture throughout this time. Because part of our culture was that you would basically just meet and hang out together and do stuff together where ideas then more easily flow. And that's hard to reproduce now that everyone is at home, basically. We do continue to have lots of the aspects of our culture. We do have plenty of discussions on mailing lists that has been as active as it has been when we were in the office. We do have remote events, like you can have like fitness classes from home. You can have certain sessions, like learning sessions from home. So a bunch of the culture elements were easy to or more or less reasonably easy to transfer, but not everything is easy to transfer. And I noticed that it was a bit of a shock for me when I came into the office, because we do have one day in the week where we can go to the office. I don't usually take them because it's not the office that I'm used to, and it's not an office that I want to be in, because it's really empty, it's really quiet. There's like restrictions where you can go, what you can do, and that's just not the Google office that I was used to. So I'm not really excited to go to the office right now. And regarding hiring, we have a hiring freeze as far as I'm aware. So there's not really that much onboarding going on. We had issues with onboarding people who we already hired. So the idea was like, you go through this Noogler onboarding, so new Googler onboarding, which is a week or two, I think. I think it's 2 weeks, where you like get introduced to Google's cultures, to your benefits, to how things work and what's expected of you, and what you can expect from others. And that's great, but it's also a thing that happened physically so far. And doing that remotely doesn't get the same energy, and you don't form the same relationships. Because I know that when I was doing the Googler onboarding, Noogler onboarding, I met a bunch of people who I'm still like working with and friends with, and that these relationships started forming there. And I'm not sure how well that would work by virtually. So while we are figuring this out, and while we are figuring out how to continue to work the way that we work, while we are constrained to home office, we are not hiring. And at least for our team, we're not having open positions right now.
Yeah, I think it's quite similar for us. We still have open positions, mostly for backend engineers, at least a few. I think frontend is not hiring right now, even though we had big hiring plans for this year. Right now, it's like more or less frozen. Sometimes for the same reasons, I think. So it's like not a good. But you were speaking about hiring on your team. So this leads
Yeah.
me to the question I never asked, by the way, and not even on the conference. I never asked for real, like how you were hired by Google.
I got an email from a recruiter, and it was actually not the first time that happened. But this time the recruiter had a job that was actually interesting for me. And as a Google recruiter reached out to me. They reached out to me in the past for positions in site reliability engineering, so basically like DevOps, which isn't necessarily what I want to be doing because that involves on-call and stuff. And I'm like, nah, that doesn't tickle my fancy. Then they reached out for a software engineering position that was interesting, but it would have been in London, and I'm not super fond of moving to London. I went into the interview. Then I had a really strange interviewer, and I was like, no, I don't think this is leading somewhere. Bye. But this time it was an actually interesting position, and the interview process, once it started, was really good and interesting. And yeah, then I ended up getting an offer, and then after a little bit of discussion, I had an offer that I would be willing to accept, and then I accepted the offer, and then I was a Googler suddenly.
Sounds like a really smooth path, but I can relate to weird interviewer moment because I also had an interview to Google. I passed, and the first stage was very weird interviewer that I was like, should I even continue? Honestly, I'm sorry because now I'm criticizing the company you work for.
No, I understand that. I criticize the company I work for when it comes to interviews because we do have a process, and I know how interviews should be done. But because wherever people are working and communicating with each other, things can go wrong, unfortunately. And that happened. We are not magical in the sense that we don't have these problems. These problems do happen at Google as well.
So, if you don't mind sharing, at least maybe without deep details, because probably this is under NDA, what went weird for you? I will share mine as well. So this is fair.
So in the first interview, I was asked a bunch of very specific questions about Unix tooling, and I'm like, I'm not interviewing for an SRE position. And then it's like, yeah, but I'm an SRE, and I'm like, why are you interviewing me for a software engineer position when you are an SRE? And I'm like, why do I have to know the parameters to ls off specifically when I can just man page them? I would type man space ls off, and then I would get the man page, and then I would know how this works, or ls off dash dash help or dash h, and then I get all these parameters, and I can pick the ones that I need. And he's like, no, you have to know them. And I'm like, right, I'm not interested in this kind of conversation. Bye-bye. And then I was out. That was turning me off. If you want me to just memorize stuff that I can just not memorize and just find out within seconds, then what's the point? And I heard that that's not even how SREs are interviewed. That was just a bad interview.
Yeah, sounds like absolutely random thing that just happened because it could. Yeah. Okay, I can share mine. For me, it was on the screening interview first, I think. So it was funny because Google recruiter messaged me 3 times, and I was like, hey, I heard about Google interviews. I'm not sure I'm interested. Also, I prefer remote work, and it was not COVID time. So you need to relocate to Munich. Munich is a nice city. But so she was convincing me to have an interview, and she was nice. So I was like, maybe I should do so. But I decided to go forward and say, hey, I heard about Google interviews. I'm a front-end engineer. So if we're going to discuss something like hash tables or something like this, let's just save our time and just don't start it, okay? She's like, of course, I understand. This is just a screening interview, not even a tech one. Literally, second question was hash tables. Exactly the same one. And I'm like,
as I say, these things happen. It's unfortunate.
I know the answer because I even said it up front. So for me, it was a turning down experience as well. That's why I was going to ask you about interviews. Does it even exist like a Google interview in general? Is it like formalized process, or it's more or less something like free questions to drop?
So it's an interesting question. The answer to that one is there is a bit of formality in the sense of that everyone who interviews as a Googler for other potential future Googlers has to go through interview training. And inside interview training, you learn what we're looking for. So basically what to interview for. So for instance, I am a trained interviewer for software engineer roles, and I am on the list for being trained for developer advocate roles as well, because we are looking for different signals, so to speak, different things in candidates that we would like to see in these candidates. And there is an internal question pool, so where you can see like interview questions that people have asked, also interview questions which are banned because they tend to be like, oh, I've seen this in a book, or oh, I've heard this before, I read this online somewhere. Or basically we just find out that they're not giving us the signals that we are looking for, then they get banned and removed from the list, which is helpful because when I do test interviews, I usually take banned questions from the interview. So when you are test interviewing with me, you get real actual interview questions, but there are ones that are not used in the actual interviews. So that's kind of nice. And it's quite interesting because you can also see the people who write these questions into the system also tell you what they would expect as an answer. And sometimes I've seen this, like questions got banned because the expected answer was just ridiculously complex and ridiculously unlikely for anyone to like it. If you're expecting someone in an interview situation to give you like a genius answer as the baseline, then that's not realistic. So these questions get removed as well, or at least like changed in the way that the expectation maps more real world experience. But in the end, once you're in the interview, you're in the interview. So you're taking notes, and you can ask pretty much any question that comes to your mind. There's no one like saying, hey, you need to ask these 3 questions, or you need to ask 3 questions to begin with. Maybe I ask only 1 question. Maybe I ask 5 questions. Maybe I let you do something like show me something that you are proud of, just to get a feeling for what level people are on. That's up to me. That's up to me as an interviewer. And most of the time, the guideline roughly is pick at least one technical question, and let the candidate basically explore options. Then walk the candidate through if they get stuck, and then try to like extract as many signals as possible that we need for making a hiring decision. Because what happens is basically the interviewer, the recruiter that works with you hands you over to the interviewers, including the screen interviewer. And then we fill in notes and we get asked specific questions about how the interview went. And then we say like, yes, no, to this degree, to that degree, and then some free text. And then that gets handed over to either the team or what's called a hiring committee. And then they look at the position at hand that you are being interviewed for. Let's say like it's a senior level software engineer position in Android, for that matter, because it's something that I have no familiarity with. And then there's like, okay, so for that's this level, senior level, and this is the stuff that we expect from a candidate on this level for this position. And this is what the interviewers, so like multiple interviewers, what they wrote. Maybe you have it's quite interesting. Sometimes you have one interviewer that just doesn't fit with the interviewee, and then you see like, oh, this person struggled with this and had problems with that, and then the next person goes like, I asked for this, I got this answer. That's the answer that I would have expected. They did this, they did that, which is more than what I expected. And then you get like very different results. But then normally it's an uneven number of interviewers, so you can like figure out if more people said like, yeah, this sounds like this person knows what they're doing, versus one person saying like, no, this is not a good thing. Then normally that's like ignored, and then we look at the good signals. But yeah, so I have a lot of freedom in the sense of how I run the interview, and I know that it's humans working, and it's part of their work time that they get dragged into interviews. And I know there has been a time where teams were under pressure in the sense of they needed new people to join because there was so much to do. But to get new people on the team to help them with all the stuff they have to do, they had to take time out of their workday and interview potential new Googlers, and you don't get to interview for your team specifically. I'm trained for software engineers, so I get software engineers. Do we hire software engineers in our team? No, we don't. We don't have software engineers specifically in our team. So I get to interview people that might not even end up on my team. And then I can see that some people might have gone into it a little more frustrated, because I know that some people have interviewed like 2 or 3 people in one day. And I can imagine that it's unfortunate to end up in a situation where you have to cover for someone else, and do like your second interview on the day, or even the third interview on the day. That might not necessarily help get the best experience out. But I know that our HR team is avoiding this situation now, and they're basically trying to spread it out more evenly. We now also are in a much better position. We have enough people to distribute interviews a little better. But yeah, how they run the interview inside the structure is basically up to the interviewer.
It's really interesting, by the way, because you have more flexible process, I would say, when you're filling positions. For us, I think it's just because we have absolutely different scale in terms of company size, right? So our interviews are way more formalized, I think. But it's because we are hiring for a very certain position. Like if we are hiring front-end engineer, we want an absolutely certain set of skills to fill it. That's why. But our interview is, so first of all, it's very practical, I would say. We might ask or not ask theoretical questions. I've been into interview training as well and interviewed people, so we can share. But the biggest part of the interview for front-end engineer, let's say, is reviewing a merge request, because it's actually what you will be doing every single day. So you have a merge request with all possible mistakes on all possible levels, and you're gonna comment on them. You're gonna fix them partly. This might be from a very stupid things like using query selector on the framework, which you don't need to do, and up to architectural issues you might solve. So it's easy to also find out a rank for the person. But also we are looking at how people write commands on merge requests, because this is very important. You can see how people communicate, how kind or not kind they are, and how they fit our culture of assuming good intentions in general.
Yes.
But I spotted an interesting moment. I think I know it. Maybe not all of the people who are watching our conversation know it as well. You were saying you're interviewing for software engineers, which means there is no distinction between backend, front-end, full stacks, whatever. There is a software engineer with a certain set of skills, and it seems that set of skills doesn't lie in terms of, it's not bound to any certain language, right?
That is true. Yeah.
So I guess
because we think you can learn the different languages if you need to. Like that's an easy one, I think. Sorry.
So this, it's completely fine, because I was going to ask. So when you ask technical questions, they lie mostly in things of like algorithms, data structures, pseudocoding maybe. So do you have any tasks like solve this, basically, like whiteboard one?
So it's that's an interesting one. So usually it is programming. It's actually, I would also say our process is reasonably practical. We are having a little different challenge here, because pretty much all of our code is ridiculously interconnected with lots of internal bits and pieces. So we can't really just like, here's a bug from our stuff, and it's like, what is this? What is this? What is this? What is this? And it's like, all right, let's give you like a week to actually introduce you to all these systems, so that we can then like work on the sample project. So we can't really do that. We can't really give you like real world code from most of the things. Sometimes when we have open source bits and pieces, that might be an interesting one, but I haven't really experimented with that yet, at least not at Google. So we can't really give you like a real world piece of code, but our sample problems are very close or analogous to actual real challenges that we are dealing with. And the signals that we are looking for are 100% practical. Like, for instance, when you're working at Google scale, things that you think are not a problem do actually become a problem. Like, for instance, you might end up dealing with routing on the internet scale. And then you have to deal with the fact that sometimes sharks bite into internet cables or something like that. You sometimes have to deal with satellite communications being like slow. That's a thing that happens. Or simply just, I have a coworker, one of the people who onboarded at the same time as me, so a Noogler friend basically. He works in Google Assistant, and he spent a month on figuring out a better algorithm and better data structure to store contact information on your phone so that Assistant knows who your contacts are. Because you have situations like, call Natalia, and then it needs to, hypothetically, you have hundreds of contacts, and it needs to be very quick to figure out who is this Natalia and who do I then need to call. And maybe this contact has multiple phone numbers, and then it needs to guide you through this process. And I said, like, yeah, but what's the problem here? You just like store it in a database. And he's like, yeah, but I'm on a phone, which is potentially very slow and has not that much memory. So I need to store things like as compact as possible. And I can't just store them in a hash map or hash table, because I don't do lookup informations. I need to search. I need to basically search for things, because maybe you're saying the first name, maybe you're saying the last name, maybe you're saying like a middle name, maybe you say something that is only marked in a comment, something like that. So it isn't trivial. And I'm like, this is a trivial problem, just like a SQLite database. And he's like, nah, not efficient enough. That would take too long. It would take too much memory. Wouldn't work. And that means that he had to figure out, and he found this super esoteric paper from a Japanese computer scientist on how to do this. And then he explained it to me, and I have to honestly say I only understood half of it. He was excited about it, and I loved it, but I only understood half of what he was saying. And I'm like, right, okay. That one I understood, yes. No, okay, now you lost me again, which was interesting. So when I do practice problems, I try to not focus too much on the programming language. You can basically pick any programming language that you want, as long as I roughly understand what the programming language does. So if you use like brainfuck or malbolge or
I was
something,
going to say, what if it's brainfuck?
Then you have to walk me through, and everything will be taking longer. But I won't like put that against you, I would say. But like, most people pick Python, C++, or Java, or Ruby, or JavaScript or something like that. Yeah, JavaScript. I picked JavaScript, and I was asked, I'm like, I'm going to take JavaScript. And yeah, that's perfectly fine, because I don't care so much about your solution. I care more about how you're getting to your solution and what you're doing once you reach the solution, and also how you approach the practice problem. Because as Google, we oftentimes run into problems that no one else had, because no one else built something like that before. I mean, how many companies have you worked for that have built a trillion website search engine for the web and pretty much everything? So oftentimes the biggest recommendation or trick from my recruiter that I can see very clearly now in how we're interviewing is to state your assumptions and make sure that you're not jumping to assumptions without stating them explicitly. Because problems that we encounter every day are underspecified. Because only as we explore the solution, we start to understand the problem more deeply. And that's a reality that we are facing every day. So I know that I have worked with engineers who were brilliant, but basically needed the problem to be clearly cut. If I would tell them, build me a web server from scratch in C that is really fast and can serve millions of requests at the same time, they would be able to do that. If I would ask them to build me this specific database for contacts on a phone, they would struggle. They would build me something, but they would not necessarily build me the thing that I need, because they would just be like, the requirements were unclear here. Welcome to the reality at Google. Requirements are pretty much always unclear. because you are the first one to do stuff like that. So most of the problems that I use are underspecified. For instance, beautiful sample project or sample problem that I use. You have a network connection between two computers, and you have a library where you can put in a string on one end and you get a string out on the other end. So you have a receive and send function, and basically you get a string. You can put a string in, you get a string out. But now you have a list. What do you do? How would you do this?
Okay. So you were like about send it one by one, or how to send it in parallel, or how to, and so on and so on.
You're going in a very good direction. So I was like, okay, hold on. If I have a list and I have a function that takes a string, I would just start to serialize this, just like exactly serialize and then split, or join and split. That's the easy thing. But then I said, like, what kind of data do I have in the list? And he's like, well, every kind of data. I'm like, okay, so in that case, I need to be careful, because if there's any kind of data, I need to make sure that the thing that I use to join or split is actually not included in the data. So I would have to escape it if necessary. And he's like, okay, fair enough. And I'm like, but hold on. How long are these lists? And how long are the individual items? And he says, well, let's assume every item is 1 byte. And then I said, well, then I don't serialize. Then I just like put them one after the other, because I know that every single byte is. But it's this kind of, you see where this is going. It sounds like, yeah, I just use join. I have so many people in the test interviews that I ask this question. They're like, I just join with like a comma or something. And then I'm like, yeah, okay, but
this is very generic thing.
Yeah. Yep. The problem is heavily underspecified, but lots of people fall for just making the assumption that it's fine, but it's not. Maybe it's not. If everything is 1 byte long, then spending 100% overhead on that just to transfer the escape or the merge character is just not a good solution, and that's inefficient. And that's if these lists are a bazillion bytes long, and you are literally paying for the bandwidth that you're spending, you're paying for the traffic that you send, paying for twice as much is not a good solution and can actually cost a lot of money. So it's not about like fancy data structures always. It starts with understanding the problem and understanding your limitations of understanding the problem. Where I say like, well, if it's just a normal short list with various different length things, then you can, of course, just join them. You just need to make sure that you escape the thing that you're joining them with, and then you can split them on the other side. But what about like, how long is this list? What is in this list? How long are the individual items in this list? And then he asked me about like time complexity and stuff in other situations. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that makes sense to know. Because if I'm not careful, then I might come up with a solution that is ridiculously slow, which is normally fine. In practical programming every day, in most jobs, it's fine, because you have like a database with a few, let's say, terabytes of data, and you'll be fine. The query will run 20 seconds. Okay, fine. But maybe we can only run the query once a day and be getting away with it. But if you are having like petabytes of data and you have to run this query every single time someone is asking a question in the search form, then no, 20 seconds is not acceptable.
This sounds like a great question, and the approach sounds like a great thing on itself, not even for interviews, but for everyday work. You reminded me that for GitLab staff engineer, for staff level, we actually have this requirement. Work on unclear requirements for the task. So it's like you need to be able to, actually not need to be able, you need to have a proven track of such tasks, like where requirements were absolutely unclear, you work on them, you figure it out, and you come up with a solution, and then you iterated the solution to make it better. But it's staff. So for Google, it's like, software engineer, please be able to work on this. This is really
it also comes to like different levels, right? We have these different levels, software engineer 1, software engineer 2, software engineer, senior software engineer 2, I think, or is it staff? I don't know how they are called, but they basically like, they go from 1 to 7, I think, where 7 is already like director level, I think. And 6, I think, is a manager already. And And when I have an interviewee who's interviewing with me, I don't necessarily know which level. Sometimes I know which level I'm interviewing for, but I think I had situations where I didn't know the level that I was interviewing for. But then you can see, like, if this person, for instance, says like, oh yeah, I just join and Splitt, and I make sure that I escape the thing and I test for a few cases. That is not impossible to work at Google. It's just not going to be a level 4 or level 5 requirement. Like, you would have to be a lot more, so a lot earlier than at staff level. You have to be aware that things, because to be fair, every single thing that you do at Google has the potential to be unclear in terms of requirements, and you have a lot of freedom. No one necessarily, like, if you're in a good team, and Google has many teams, and I can't speak for all of the teams, but the teams that I worked with, they were in a way organized in a way that you have freedom, but you take responsibility. And that means that you have to make decisions. And you make these decisions not in a space where everything is clear and obvious and easy, because we are not doing the same thing over and over. I've worked at agencies. We had a certain CMS, and when we made small changes to the CMS, that's what I did for like half a year or a year. We did more or less the same thing. Of course, every single time was different. Every single customer was different. Every single feature was different. But the environment that I was in was very clear cut. I knew what the CMS could do. I knew what the CMS couldn't do. Of course, we pushed the boundaries there, but we knew where we are going with this. Whereas here, and I learned that basically the second week after my onboarding, I had a lunch with my manager, and I said, so now that I'm through onboarding, what do you need me to do? And he said, what do you think you need to do? And that shocked me for a moment, because I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, we hired you because you know what you're doing. And I'm pretty sure that you already have ideas of what you would like to be doing. So tell me, what is it that you think you need to be doing? And I said, like, well, I don't know. So one thing that makes me confused is that many developers don't really know about SEO and don't really see it as a technical challenge. And he's like, well, what are you going to do about it? I'm like, I don't know, maybe figure out what they know, and then from there try to figure out and understand what they should know, and then try to fill the gap. And he's like, okay, so how do you think you can fill the gap? I'm like, I don't know. Make a tutorial, write documentation, maybe do a few presentations at conferences. He's like, sounds good. I'm like, yeah, but what if I'm getting it wrong? And he's like, well, then we learn how not to do it. Then we do it again, differently, better.
That was my next question you're touching, by the way, because you mentioned responsibility, right? And making decisions, taking responsibility, which means, what if you did fail? Because this inevitably will happen in such an environment, right?
Yeah. And boy, does it happen often.
I mean, the bigger freedom is, the bigger is the chance that you choose wrong path. And I mean, choosing wrong paths in such things is just a way to get an experience. But how does Google handle this? So you failed it. Like, you spent your working hours, your effort, your time, whatever you wanted, your resources, let's say, on something that completely didn't work. What do you do now? What are consequences?
That's amazing, because that happened multiple times in my career at Google. So normally the way that you do it is like you are presenting, or you're talking to your coworkers about the idea. And oftentimes they don't, I mean, if you're doing something obviously stupid, then they might have ideas on how to do it better, or they might just warn you about potential pitfalls that you might not have seen, which is great. So that happens naturally. But let's say they didn't know, because that happens. They sometimes also, no one's perfect. And if I'm like, I think we should be making this. So for instance, I made a code lab that has not gotten that much attention, which is fine. It's just, I spent a lot of work on making the sample and writing the code lab and deploying it. And I had support from our tech writer. So she spent time with me on this code lab and making it fine and nice and shiny. And then we published it, and not that many people used it. And those who used it didn't like go bananas about it. So I'm like, okay, right. that was a lot of effort for not that much outcome, but we measured. Like we measured what we put in, we figured out what we got out, and I said, yeah, let's not do this again. And I wrote down what happened, what went well, what didn't go so well, why I think it didn't work. And then I tried to figure out what else I can do, and I proposed a few solutions, and then we looked at them together, and we said like, okay, yeah, that was an interesting experience. I don't think our audience is the right audience for this kind of content, and it's not the way that these teams work together. So that we are addressing a person that doesn't exist. And they're like, okay, that's actually very good to know, because we're doing content strategy planning for next year for our new documentation. And it turns out that this personnel, or this persona that we have here in our head doesn't exist. So we don't need to plan content for them, because it hasn't worked out so far. And it also, there is not that much requests in that direction. So we learned something here. So we actually saved time in another thing because of something that I sunk time into. And yeah, that's it. Like, there's no hard feelings. There's no problem. If something fails, no blame. If something fails spectacularly and publicly, visibly, even if it doesn't fail visibly, but like if something fails more profoundly, if it's not something small like that, but let's say like search index stops adding new pages for a day or an hour, then there's a post-mortem as well, where we look at, so this is what happened, this is why it happened, this is why we didn't catch it, or this is how we could have caught it and didn't because of this and that. And then we learn where our weak points are, and then we learn how to fix them, and then we move on. There's no blame, there's no grudges being held. Things didn't work out the way that we expected, but we trust everyone to make the best decisions based on the data they had. And sometimes that's just not enough and things go wrong. That's what happens.
Yeah, I think it's a sign of a really great company culture, because this gives people freedom to experiment and kind of let them get rid of the fear to fail. Because it happens a lot on agencies. I know this for sure. Like, do your stuff, don't make mistakes. If you do too many mistakes, you probably will just be fired. But if you're free, it's like, and I think I really like this on both Google and GitLab. You rely hard on retrospectives, like postmortems or less formal retrospective. Anyway, you analyze what has been done, how not to repeat these mistakes, and what we learned, right?
Yeah.
This
because like even with the things that go well, you can always improve. And we look back and we are honest at us. For instance, I recently ran a pretty interesting virtual event, and it was a different format than the usual things. We had a virtual unconference, so very interactive sessions. And when people ask me, so like, how is the conference, like, how do you do this? How do you do that? I'm like, I don't have all the answers. We'll figure it out. We don't know. We've never done this before. I don't know anyone else who's done this before. There might have been like virtual unconferences beforehand, I'm sure, but I don't know of any, and I haven't seen any, and I haven't read anything. I obviously Googled for it. I didn't find that much information on how to do this. So we just had to figure it out ourselves. And afterwards, my fantastic coworker, Aurora Morales, was helping me with this. And she and I just wrote a little retrospective afterwards and said like, okay, so here's what went really well. That's what we want to keep. And here are things that we want to do differently. And for instance, we want to have a program manager who helps us keeping everything on track, because we had like a few Google Docs and a few Google Sheets that at least like helped us kept reasonably well structured, I would say. But I was overwhelmed with the amount of work that went into this event, and alone I wouldn't have made it possible. I would have just like burned out at some point. Together with Aurora, we did it well, but we could have done it with less stress. I mean, no one outside knew this, but we were like super worked out afterwards and worn out afterwards. And it was a lot of stress to get this all rolling. And we're like, we're not doing this again. We are getting us help from someone who knows how to do these things like properly. And there's something to learn in everything, good or bad.
Exactly. I completely agree with these. We had this. I mean, even mentioned database incident kind of shows that we are going the same way. No blame. Let's just fix the damage that was done, if there was any damage, and let's learn something and just move on with this. And this
Yeah,
brings me to the
and
company culture. So this is one of the questions I was going to ask as well about interviews, because we were focusing more on technical things, right? Like tech interviews, but there should be something on the interview process that kind of checks if the person
yeah,
is a good match for company culture.
yeah, yeah. We do that. It's called the googliness bits and pieces, and these interviews are either part of the regular interview. So basically, as I said, like we have a list of signals that we want to see. One is definitely, does this person know what they're doing? So you do have to know at least a little bit about the consequences of the code that you write. As in, like, you don't have to know the exact implementation of a sorting algorithm because that's something that you can look up, but you should at least like roughly know that maybe bubble sort isn't the best idea to implement in a practical application. You should at least have some idea of what the complexity or runtime complexity of your solution looks like. So if you're not able to understand that, if basically the task is look up if something is in a list, then you can do better than O(n) squared. So you can do better
Yeah.
than looking at n squared or doing n squared operations for a list of n items. You should understand that you can do this in O of n, so you only look at every item once. And if your solution doesn't reflect that, you should at least be able to say like, well, this is not an optimal solution, but it's the quickest that I could come up with. Do you want me to iterate on this so that I can get down to O of n? Because that's what I would expect the solution to be doing. But there is also the googliness bit. So we have a few signals that we look out for in terms of company culture, which is a super tight road to walk, because on one hand, you want diversity and inclusion and equity. So you want to make sure that not just because someone doesn't do your kind of nerdiness or geekiness. So if, for instance, you could say like, oh, at Google, everyone is I don't know, Star Wars fan. So if you're not a Star Wars fan, you can't become a Googler. That's bullshit. We have Star Wars fans, we have Star Trek fans, we have people who don't like either. We are a huge group of people with so many diverse backgrounds and different perspectives and different upbringings and cultures, and it's amazing. But that also means that when we are saying company culture, we have to be careful that we are not accidentally biasing or accidentally or deliberately balancing and biasing against people from certain groups. And that's where, for instance, if someone is like doesn't laugh at my jokes, that's not a thing that we care about. Like if you don't like my humor, that's perfectly fine. You can still be a Googler. If you're younger than me, if you're older than me, if you are looking different than me, that's not a criteria that we look for. That's not a signal that we're interested in. But we are interested in a few qualities. We want to make sure that you can work in an environment that changes a lot frequently, because that's the environment that Google is. We do change frequently. We want to make sure, and it's not helping if we hire someone who needs like things to stay the same, because we're then in an environment that might not necessarily be productive for this person. We can make accommodations for certain parts, but like if you really, I'm like, I have done this 10 years, the last 10 years I have written C++ like this, and that's why I continue to write C++ like this, then maybe Google isn't the company for you. I'm not saying that we are not, like, if you're having issues with sensory overload, for instance, that's fine. That's fine. You can figure out, or we can figure out together, a place, a spot where you're not like overwhelmed, and that can be accommodated for. But if you want to stick to what you know and don't want to grow and don't want to learn, then you might not be the right person to work at Google. Or as we say, like you have to thrive in ambiguity. That's not just the fact that our requirements might not be complete and might be ambiguous, but actually the entire thing is hard and ambiguous. And I saw this. I hope our lawyers aren't watching, but there was a huge discussion, and it's really tricky because I have an opinion on this, but it's just that it's an opinion. It's not a fact, and it's not a obviously morally right or wrong stance to have. We have coworkers in China. We do have offices in China, and they're lovely, fantastic engineers. I love working with them. And when there was the discussion, should we give up Google as in Google search in China? And on one hand, yes, of course. From my personal perspective, I was like, yes. Initially, at least, I was like, yes, of course. I mean, it's a state that oppresses its opponents and yada yada yada, and all these like political problems. I think we should not provide our services there. But then I talked to our Chinese coworkers, and they're like, that's a terrible stance because the alternative, the other search engines that they have available, are not good and sometimes not safe, in the sense of lots of people have access to internet but not access to a doctor. So they search for what we call your money, your life queries. So things like, weird rash on my hand, what do I need to do? And then Google understands that that's a very sensitive query and tries to find as reliable information as possible, or flags issues with certain pieces of information. And we definitely do our best to not have spam in these queries. Of course, it's not a perfect system. We also do have spam in the results for these queries, but we're trying our best to get that out. But if we would leave the Chinese market, people would would search for things like that and then find terrifyingly bad advice and scammers and like bad medicine and stuff like this. And then people might die. So our Chinese coworkers were absolutely not fond of that idea. And I'm like, I never thought of this. And I don't think we want to have this responsibility. But that's the reality. Welcome in the reality where it's not just a small, funny company that is, I don't know, building like a list of things that you can buy, that you can scroll through and then buy from. We are having a bit more responsibility than you'd think. And I want to see that the person who builds a system, or like who wants to build systems with Google, understands the responsibility that they have. I also want to see that they have the empathy to understand our users and that they focus on the users, not themselves or other. I've worked in companies and I've seen other companies where developer teams were like, yeah, we know that it's slow, but hey, do you know how hard it is to build that solution? And I'm like, I don't accept that, because we are getting paid to build a good solution for the user. So whatever hardness I experience doesn't matter, as long as what I put out works best for the user. If I'm doing something that is not as good as it could be for the user just because I'm lazy, then I shouldn't be in this position. And that's something that is one thing that we look for. In terms of company culture, you should be open to growing. You should be open to learning new things. You should be open to other cultures. You should have respect for the others. You should have respect for other people's opinions, as well as their backgrounds and perspectives on things. And as I said, I had this conversation with Chinese coworkers that opened my eyes. And to be fair, if we are saying like, oh yeah, we shouldn't provide services to fascist countries, then that excludes a lot of other countries as well. And you could argue which countries would be on that list, because it's also not a very easy yes/no kind of question. It's like, should we cease service in Hungary? Should we cease service in the US? Should we cease service in Germany? Should we cease service in Russia? Should we cease service in parts of Germany where questionable political forces are at work?
Yeah,
it's
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 really
not that
complicated.
easy. Yeah, and you have to deal with that. You have to deal with that, and you should be up for it, and you should have the necessary empathy and openness and emotional intelligence to deal with it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's like with great power comes great responsibility, right? When you
Yeah,
work on scale of Google, this becomes extremely important. But
yeah,
we were speaking about what would you like to see in the person you interview? Are there, like, on the contrary, are there like absolute red flags for you? And in my experience, these red flags mostly lie in terms of soft skills, because when we speak
yeah.
about programming tech skills, it's nothing like a red flag. It's like, okay, this
No,
is more or less good. This is a bit worse,
yeah,
but we can work on this. So, are there
yeah.
any red flags of you for the person you interview?
Yes. So as you say, like if it's a technical difficulty, I would say, then that usually just means that I would recommend to hire the person on a lower level, if that's an option. So if they're applying for a senior role and I see like, okay, the data structures and algorithms are not very strong in this candidate, maybe a junior role or a developer, intermediate developer role might fit better to this person. Red flags in terms of personality traits, definitely when people are super disrespectful, and that includes being disrespectful of other people's time, which unfortunately is something that you can also find with Googlers sometimes. But that's a different story then, because then you can have a conversation with them about this. And yeah, so if someone is definitely disrespectful about things that are happening around what I observe, then that's an issue. If they run very late without letting me know that, I mean, every one of us can get stuck in a traffic jam or someone gets sick or something. Just and you get the information on how to reach your recruiter and your interviewer, so you can reach out and let us know that there is a problem. It wasn't at Google, but it was at a different company where we had someone who interviewed with us, and he showed up half an hour late to a 45-minute interview first time and said like, yeah, I have this problem with traffic. And we're like, oh, okay, let's just reschedule. So we rescheduled. Uh, the second time we rescheduled, he was in a train, which was very noisy. We're like,
What more you
really?
can
And
say
that
here?
just, yeah. And then we're like, look, if you can't, and we were like super open to, like, he suggested the time and the date, so it's not that we were like, oh, we only have this time frame here. He could have picked a different time slot and a different date if that wouldn't work, or could have let us know like, oh, by the way, something came in and I can't really like deal with this now, I'm super sorry. We would have potentially like rescheduled again, but it was impossible to have an interview. So we basically just wrote down like that we couldn't understand most of what the person was saying because they were on a very noisy train, and they didn't want to reschedule either. So we didn't want to reschedule either. So um, that's a red flag for me, because that just means that you're not respecting the time of the others and you're not respecting the opportunity as well. Another red flag is if they make remarks that show me that they lack the basic human decency and basic human empathy as well. If they would come in and like make really inappropriate jokes, for instance, that's a red flag where I'm like, yes, we are a fun company, yes, we are a fun bunch, and yes, we do have fun together, but that doesn't mean that you should be making jokes on the expense of others, for instance. That's not an okay thing to do. Um, Also, if I have the feeling that they are, especially in phone, that's not as much in with in-person interviews, but phone screens. If you have the feeling that they are cheating in one way or the other, that's a red flag. That's a huge red flag, and that has happened. We have seen that people were basically like video calling someone else in who was then like doing stuff for them and things like this, where I'm like, okay, what's happening here? So that's a huge red flag. Uh, yeah. Or if they are I know that interview situations are stressful and tricky, but I do everything I can to accommodate the person I'm interviewing with. And I also very explicitly ask for certain things. For instance, I at least very specifically say, like, oh, by the way, when you are going into like trying to solve this, would you be so kind of walking me through the process of how you're solving this by like thinking out loud? It's okay if you need a few minutes to like think it through in your head and then explain it to me, but I would like you to guide me through the way that you are solving this problem so that I can understand. That's not just for my own comfort, it's also if you get stuck somewhere, I know where you get stuck and I know how you were thinking to get there, and then I can potentially unblock you as well, which is good for you
Yeah, like
as well
Dutch.
as it is for me. But if you are basically, if you really, really just have to, I don't know, sit in a corner for 20 minutes thinking silently, then I'm not 100% sure how well that would work in Google's company culture, where we work together on things. It's very, very rare that you are working on one huge problem alone for a longer time. You're usually like working on small bits and pieces, and then you work with others to make it into a large thing. Um, so yes, of course, every one of us sometimes needs an hour away from other people to like think things through and focus a little bit. And I know that interview situations aren't optimal, but also the interview problems we are giving are not basically build a rocket that can send humans to Mars. You have 10 minutes, go. Um, so you should be able to communicate about also not just the solution that you came up with, but you should also be able to communicate about the process that takes you there. Because what if it is a really complicated thing and you need the help of or the brain power of your coworkers, which is a fantastic tool to have available. Um, but then you can't communicate at all. That's a
Yeah,
problem.
I was going to say that it seems that almost all red flags you mentioned lie in the communication field. So it's like if you're not respectful of other times and you don't communicate upfront, you're late. It's fine to be late. Sometimes we're all humans.
Yeah.
Sometimes things happen, right?
Yeah.
Just communicate it. Say about it.
Yeah.
Excuse and so on and continue. And
And also
same for
take
like coding.
responsibility for what you're doing. Yeah. That's the other thing.
Exactly. If you
I've
work,
seen people who are blaming their mistakes and their problems in the solution on the problem being specified, and I'm like, no,
I know this. I know this very good. And this is very annoying when people just, oh, it's a bad framework, it's a bad
yeah,
code base, it's bad everything, basically just not my code.
yeah. And the best thing is when you let them pick the programming language that they want to do this interview in, and then they pick, let's say, JavaScript, and then they're like, oh yeah, in other languages I would have known how to do this, and I'm like, why did you pick this language then? Why? I mean, that's not a
Exactly.
red flag, but I'm like, it's weird that this person picked this language. So don't pick languages just to impress the other side. It's like, I will do it in C++. And then it turns out that they have only very basic C++ skills. And like half of the things that C++ offers, they don't know, which is fine. But then just don't pick it as a highlight reel in your interview. Go with Ruby, go with
Exactly.
Python, go with JavaScript.
Go
It's
with
okay. Trust me.
JavaScript.
I went with JavaScript, and I went so far as this is an interesting thing that I did, and I'm not sure if that was necessarily like is reflective of every interviewer, because I wrote a thing for one practice problem and then said, I'm not 100% sure if this works the way that I expect it to work, because I'm not sure about the syntax of this one thing here. But because it's JavaScript and the interview happened on a Chromebook where I had a browser in front of me, I was like, would you mind if I copy and paste this into the console and then just run the function
Console.
with a few, like with a bit of data? And he's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. And I basically just like copy pasted my code into the console in the browser, and then just ran the function with a few inputs. And I'm like, oh no, this does not work the way that I would have expected it. And I'm pretty sure it's because of this line. And I changed the line, and then it worked the way I expected. And I'm like, yeah, there we go. And that was a syntax problem because I forgot the syntax of this one thing. I think the way slice works, I misused the one parameter form of slice for slicing a string. And I'm like, yeah, now it does what it needs to do. There we go. And that was okay. As far as I can tell, I mean, I got hired in the end, so.
Honestly, like slice, split, and splice, like for me, every single time I need to Google a signature, just because sometimes you just forget it. Oh, by the way, I think one of the last questions, because we're almost on time, like
we're
on the
running
interview
out of time, yeah.
to Google, are you allowed to Google actually if you forgot a syntax or something like this?
I think yes. I think generally, because it takes time and you're not sure how fast the person actually can look up the thing, you most of the time, either if you know it, you just say what it is, or you're just like, okay, it doesn't matter. Let's assume this is pseudocode. It doesn't, because it doesn't really matter to me as long as you say like, so I assume this slices off the last character. Or like, I assume this function gives me everything except the last character. I'll be like, fine. That's what I need to know. I understand if I can then like try to understand if the function does what it needs to do, and if I come to the same conclusion as you, then we're good. If you obviously want to run your code, then then I would probably let you look it up if time permits. It also depends a little bit on the time. I have 45 minutes to do an interview. If I see that I want to do like a practice problem, and then I want to increase the difficulty of the practice problem, and then I want to hear a little bit about the candidate, like what do they like, what environment do they strive in, what do they think is something that they would not like, which is also helpful if they say like, I really don't like to be given full freedom, I want to have a structure, then I'm like, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Not sure if every team provides you that structure, so that's an important information for the hiring committee. If I see that they take up 30 minutes with the first practice problem, then I might cut that short at that point so that I get to the conversation bit and avoid running over time. But normally, yeah, sure. If you want to Google for things, I as an interviewer would not be against this because that's realistic. What's the point in memorizing everything? You shouldn't have to Google how to make a variable in JavaScript. If that's something that you need to Google, then I'll write that down. Has happened in the past. Not the JavaScript variable, but I've seen someone struggle in Golang to make an array, and I'm like, right, but you picked Golang, didn't you? Like I didn't make you go with Golang. Oh yeah, I know the language. I'm like, interesting.
And you didn't know how to create an array.
That was the case, and I mean, I understand that, because if you would ask me now on the spot, I have written Go programs, but I have also written many other programming languages. So I'm not 100% sure if I am 100% sure of how to do this in Go. But I can look that. I would type it into my editor, and then I would see if it's accepted or not. And then if not, then I take the other form that I think it is. But if I pick that language, that's the reason why I wouldn't pick Go right now as my interview language, because I'm not sure about everything. Does that mean that I can't write Go programs? No, I would pick JavaScript, because at the current time, I work with JavaScript every single day. I work with Go once a month. And then I don't have to make an array. What I do is I basically plug different microservices together and work through the outcome that I get. Basically, I look at the results, and then I generate things from the results. Do I know how to make a slice? No. I don't. I can look that up if I need to. Does that mean that I'm a Go programmer? I would not call myself a Go programmer. Can I write complicated Go programs? Hell yes, I have written interesting things in Go. Doesn't mean that I only write Go, so I don't know all the bits and pieces. But then don't choose it as your highlight language in an interview.
This is like super neat advice for anyone who is going to have a Google interview. Like, choose the tool you really know. I hope you know
Yes.
at least one, so choose it for real.
They should know that, yeah. And if you
Yay!
do know it, then that's great.
Thank you so much for this interview. It was like so many insights for myself. I think not only for the people who are listening. It was really, really inspiring, by the way. Like
Awesome.
a few examples. I mean, the example about Chinese people that use Google, this was like absolutely incredible one, because I think about myself as a person who has an empathy, but for some reason this didn't come to my mind. So it was
It
great.
isn't
Thank you.
immediately obvious, yeah. Thank you so much, Natalia. The
Yeah.
questions were fantastic, and I loved how you guided us through the conversation, and I hope that it was useful for everyone in the conversation. I see that Irina has joined us again.
Yay!